What is going on? Welcome to the episode. We've got my boy Andy Triana back on the show. So you may remember him from episode 112. And we've got him back to talk about the brain, belief, habit building, learning, all sorts of good stuff. Now, this episode is more technical, but what I did is I went through the episode and inserted definitions of the technical terms that were mentioned so you can follow along. Now, I would recommend listening to this episode maybe, 2-3 times just because you're going to grasp more and more of it each time. Now, there is a lot of science-specific stuff in this episode, but there's also a bunch of philosophical stuff that is really, really cool. And Andy and I bounce back and forth between the two. So let's jump right in. Andy and I start by talking about how he got into studying the brain and cognitive science to begin with.
I had just really gotten deep into, cognitive neurological science as a whole. And I was always aware of it, but it wasn't necessarily like my primary passion or niche, especially because I was doing so much upfront coaching. So I slowly started diving deeper into it, and I was overwhelmed with how much I liked it, and I didn't really expect to. Around that time, I was given a job opportunity that obviously forced me to leave, forced me to put more emphasis on confidentiality and all that stuff. So I went with it. I was like, you know what? This is the perfect time to get away from social media, refine my own skills, get a clearer vision of what I want to do with stuff, and just everything in that realm, like a true, a metaphysical refinement in a lot of ways. I was like, 25 to 27 is an interesting age for a lot of people as well. You get this new thing called the fully matured prefrontal cortex.
Exactly.
And you also have to taxes and life insurance, and you start meeting adults, because regardless, when you're 22, you're just not really an adult yet, even though you feel like one.
100%.
So I was going through all that at once, and I was like, you know what? I got so much feedback about stories. Looking back at during this period when I was off social media, I was like, what did I enjoy the most, and what did people interact with the most from an enjoyment perspective? Because I realized you can stare at anything you want to learn and just not learn it. Even if you took Adderall and stared at it really hard and you read those words 15 times in a row, that's not what's going to transfer over. And I know I'm going in a lot of circles, but it'll come to a succinct point at the end. But I started looking at how do people that shouldn't know things, quote unquote, because they didn't study or because they didn't go to school, how do these people acquire knowledge? And it's through talking, it's through stories, it's through mistakes, it's through others. And it's a lot more through observation and data analytics than it is being spoon-fed information, because no one's if you're learning something as a business owner and you're every day in the business, no one's going to come up to you and tell you hey, here's a little tax break, or hey, people respond better to this, or hey, have you realized that you've been doing this every single day and it doesn't benefit you? Whatever it may be, you only get that through a mistake or something you observe through somebody else in real life. So I'm getting overwhelmed with all this stuff, and I realized people learning is not the information being out there. The information's been out there forever. A solid amount of research that's life-changing is totally free on Google Scholar and comes up in the first 5 research results. What separates the knowledge from being truly tangible to everybody is that emotional connotation, story-like association that makes it feel like it's something real to you. Because think about it this way, you read about some novel peptide, maybe it's a fat loss, whatever it is. When it's on paper, you're like, what the hell am I reading? These NMTs? It doesn't mean anything to you. They're so small. Even if you had a microscope, you couldn't see it. So you need some type of, similar with an interaction with a friend, some joke, some type of thing that lets your guard down and lets you two start to talk a little bit more in the first place. And it's difficult to do that with an inanimate object like knowledge or reading or whatever it is, but it still exists. Think about how many things that are just purely, object-based realities that you love, whether it's your cup of coffee in the morning, or there's infinite little stupid things that make large conformational changes in people's moods and stuff. So all this summated to, I'm going to become a brain philosopher storyteller. And that is what I think is going to get people to have better command over themselves. Not to be like talking too much, but I'm an empath, man. And there's a lot of stuff going on in the world that bothers me. And I realized it's all because, in my opinion, with my neurological bias, it's like people only have one behavior strategy. It's coffee or a stimulant or anger or aversion. And that's one strategy for one person. Typically people typically pick one thing and they just stick with it and play that card over and over. They keep hitting the hammer on their thumb and they're like, damn, my thumb's swollen, but I only drink coffee, so we're just going to keep hitting it, you know and I realized just the lack of knowledge. So it circled me back to, how can I tell stories, ask questions, and phrase like lenses to people that let them find the answers on their own. And that's how like the Go Super Brain idea came real.
Very cool, man. There are a million directions that we could go from there. So I like this. Now, where do you start with people? Like, how do you sort of get them in the door, approach this as a framework? Like, where do you begin? Is it that passion piece? Is it, finding out what they're interested in? Because obviously when they come to you and they want to learn something, they're interested in that thing. And so they're emotionally invested, you would think. But the more emotionally invested somebody is, the more reason they have to learn something, chances are the faster they're going to learn it. So anyways, where do you start with folks?
So I actually start with questions and breaking down your emotional attachment, because it's probably not real. In the sense of, the common ones with trainers. I want to lose weight. No, you don't want to lose weight. You want to lose fat. But it gets so much deeper than that when people say they want to do this because X. And it's like, well, what does X mean to you? So Go Superbrain's first videos, and Go Superbrain goes like linearly forward. So everything's meant to be like a story that you watch in order. The first layer of videos have to do with phenomenology, as you could expect if you've known me for long enough.
Phenomenology is basically just how we perceive different things based on our own subjective experience.
And the introduction of learning actually has risk, and I think when people don't understand is, how did you get to that bad habit in the first place? Oh, I picked up a bad habit. What do you mean you picked up a bad habit? Why? Did you want to? No, but I just started smoking cigarettes. It's like, well, how did you get there? And people don't really want to accept, or are ready to accept, the fact that your brain's constantly looking for something to learn from. And that's how you get onto those bad habits. Meaning there is actually a risk to tapping into a vice at a time in your life you shouldn't tap into. There is a risk to breaking a routine because you think you deserve it, when that concept is even really far-fetched anyway. You know what I mean? So those are like the very first things I want to expose people to. The fact that it's not like a free ball game, and the fact that your personal connotation puts connotation on how the interactions with the world around you go. And now we're slowly moving into sleep and memory. And the first like chapter, so to speak, because I have like a greater vision for everything. The first chapter is exposing everybody to themselves. So it's like, it's not just I need these types of foods and this type of sleep. It's more correlated to, like I said, who you are as a person. So that's what the first chapter is about. Figure yourself out and figure out the life and day you want to live. Right now I'm single and I'm in the New York City area. So it's easy to meet a lot of people. So obviously I'm going to collect some data from this, right? I'm not just, I'm not going to not go out and not learn something. So I ask everybody the same question, more or less, at some point, and it's, one, do you like yourself? And two, if you could work and live the perfect day, what would it be? And no one ever answers it right for the most part. And that's maybe why I'm still single. But when people say, do they like themselves? It's an interesting paradigm to bring up, right? Because it's like, I don't know. If you put your qualities on paper, the things that you do most often, what you did last weekend, at a moment where you could have done something deplorable, what'd you end up picking? And you put all that on paper without your name, would you be comfortable with that person? And furthermore, if you could do whatever you want, here's $15 million. Don't fuck it up. What do you do?
Right. So How do people typically answer that question? Do you like yourself, and how would your day typically look?
Well, I separate them because I don't want it to be
Okay,
awkward, obviously.
fair
But like,
enough.
and it's when it comes up in conversation naturally. So it's like, hey, like, so do you like yourself? And most people don't really confuse it or get it rather. They confuse it with self love, in the
Hmm.
sense of like, oh yeah, I like massage my feet once a week when I get a pedicure, and like, maybe I get drunk and whatever, that like these things. And I always correct them. I'm like, no, well, that's like self care, self love. It's stuff you do to heal yourself. And then I bring it up, like, if you had to write stuff on paper, would you do it? And most people just give a very vague answer because, like, oh, yeah, but I don't regret anything, but I always wanted to do this and be this type of person. That's like the best answer you'll get.
So, how do you answer that question? If I was to say, do you like yourself? How would you answer it?
Well, obviously, I've asked myself hundreds of times this.
Sure.
So at this point, I can say, yeah, I do. If I was to meet anybody on the planet, I'd have no issues acting exactly the same, and I'd feel zero guilt or stress about that. If I had to tell anybody that I'm friends with what I've been doing all week, I'd have no problems with that. And it's not that I've necessarily changed a lot of things I do. I actually do almost all the same things I've always done, but it's my personal guilt and connotation related to them has changed a lot. And I actually stumbled onto this because that was my sleep issue. Believe it or not, my sleep issues always arise from my frontal cortex. I will wake myself up in the middle of the night thinking, or I will respond to my own dreams with like connotative thoughts, and that wakes me up.
Interesting. Do you journal?
Kind of. I don't write in my journal. I use a business journal, but my personal stuff I approach in the mornings as the sun rises in like a meditative fashion.
Oh, cool. Okay. So, how does that look?
Right now I want to lose a little bit of weight and lean out a little bit. So I get on a treadmill for 20 minutes facing the sun as it rises over like Manhattan, and I don't do anything. I force myself to not plan, not be methodical, not respond to my own thoughts, and not try to be quiet either. It's almost like 20 minutes of like freelance buffering, but I don't let, like I said, anything come to the forefront of my mind. I kind of let things just kind of settle on my phone on me, and I just go back to normal. I grab the dog, we go outside, we sit outside for a little bit. Now I start to prioritize my day a little bit, and then I go from there.
That's super cool. I love that light exposure aspect first thing in the morning. It just makes perfect sense. So, that sort of leads us into sleep. How, if at all, can someone learn without adequate sleep or proper sleep? Like, how impaired are you? You know what I mean? Because when I think about learning, the first place my brain goes is sleep.
Mhm.
But how do you sort of look at that and approach it?
So, an analogy and story, ironically enough, I tell in Ghost Superbrain is the story of the swordsmith. And you may or may not have heard me tell this before, but essentially, when a swordsmith is creating a sword, they start out with this block of like whatever iron, metal, steel you're using, right? And you go through these periods of getting it red hot and changing it ever so slightly with a hammer, but you can't make too much change at once because it'll become brittle and break. And then they cool it, and then the process begins again. And that's metaphorically how learning actually happens. We have this hyperstimulatory process paired with a restorative process. The restorative process is sleep. Interesting, though. If you want to make concrete change and learn concrete things, you do need sleep. But if it was something emotional, metaphysical, philosophical, you don't need the sleep. However, the interesting dual edged sword there is what you miss out on in sleep will impact mood and perception, therefore making philosophical, metaphysical, emotional change more difficult. And there's another, converse reciprocal issue with if you want to be hyper stimulatory, there is an opportunity where sleep can impair your ability to do so if you time it or use it inappropriately. So there really is, unfortunately, a somewhat specific way that you have to learn, no matter what the concept, task, domain is. Fortunately, our body's completely preset to foster that in you. That's what the whole point of the circadian rhythm is, to learn things. And that's like an opinion I've slowly changed over the years. Like, why the fuck do we even have this thing? Like, no other creatures have this thing. And it's, just kind of where my head goes. But the type of learning actually matters very much.
Okay, so how would the type of learning alter your approach to sleep then? Because from the mental, emotional, metaphysical aspect, is dreaming not really important to sort of figure that stuff out too? So I'm curious to dig into that.
So let's actually talk about REM and deep sleep before we
Yeah.
talk about types. So I don't like to talk about, and you know this just by knowing me, when we get to specific biology, I try to eliminate connotation altogether. And I think that's also one of my inspirations for Go Super Brain, because everyone knows stories and analogies help people learn, but then they'll say something totally stupid and useless and it doesn't help, So I think REM and deep sleep have that attached to them. First, people like, they're thinking about it, it's like, oh, my eyes move fast and I dream, my eyes don't move fast and I don't dream. They don't occur at the same time. They have their own neighborhood regions, they have their own needs and things that they modulate to improve your quality of life after sleep. Most importantly, though, sleep's auto-regulated by your pons. So you never, ever, ever have ever slept the same 2 nights in a row.
The pons is a part of your brain stem.
And that's the first thing to understand. So this auto-regulation of sleep occurs during the day. And we have these data analytic like systems that are based in your immune system, actually learning about to what degree, novelty, and total amount of damage you're suffering from in a specific area, whether it's cortical, whether it's cellular, everywhere in the whole neighborhood of the body. Once you fall asleep, your pons is like, okay, we need X amount of deep immune restoration repair through like, your NK cells and T cells and like those macrophages, all that stuff. The typical immune system you learn about in like school the first time through. Then we have the attenuation of what's called noradrenergic inhibition. And this is a really fancy term for meaning our adrenaline receptors, specifically for norepinephrine, are so smart, quote unquote, that they can actually regulate their own sensitivity based on how much is previously binded to them. And it's not that it's like a personification that there's like someone at a computer and they're, nope, not today, buddy. But it's just that the metabolic waste associated with a norepinephrine binding to the noradrenergic receptor going through its whole cycle is a bit higher than other things. So it's easy to desensitize itself. That happens during REM sleep. The type of muscle damage that you may have incurred is going to alter this. If you happen to intervene with growth hormone, alcohol, or some type of benzo, that is also totally different.
Benzo is short for benzodiazepine, and these drugs are often prescribed to treat conditions like anxiety, insomnia, and things like seizures.
So the type of sleep is actually a lot more specific than people think. And that's what I meant correlates with the type of learning. And this is where the world of interference comes in and exists. And the interference definition and stuff is actually the answer to your question. So let's say I want to learn, or better, I'm already good at math. I'm already good at this rigid stuff. All of a sudden, I want to start learning like, I don't know, like ancient scriptures of the Egyptians and read hieroglyphics, like as polar opposite as you could possibly go. Amidst this, I want to go from being a marathon runner to a power lifter. And you start trying to do these at the same time. And let's assume that you were previously a really great marathon runner, really great mathematician, and you're just like, we're doing it, right? You're actually choosing things that are different enough and conflicting enough that you won't learn either very well. And it's because when you go to sleep, this is what interference describes. It's your pons. It's like, zzz, 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 what the hell? Like we can't REM sleep and non-REM sleep at the same time, we also can't get into deep sleep because we have such a novel stimuli coming in from all this new shit. We actually can't even get parasympathetic enough to get into deep sleep. So that cooling process of the sword never happens properly. And then it keeps getting slightly more and more brittle. And that brittle sword in this analogy is your inability to learn.
So is that an argument for essentially not learning, not trying to learn too much at once?
Yes, and maybe switching too much with not learning too different at once. The cost of change is high. And we know this like in every aspect of our lives, especially fat loss. It's like people know that if you're losing a lot of fat, it's okay to be tired and take a nap. But it goes same way neurologically up top. If you're learning something totally different, if it's your first time being on one leg in the gym and you're a personal trainer, maybe training someone elderly or very young, because that's easy to you can't take that as like, oh my God, this person doesn't care or can't try, or they're just not trying hard enough to focus and do this single leg work. They've never done it before. How do you do something you've never done before?
So in the case, say, let's say you wanted to learn the hieroglyphics or whatever, what would you pair or not pair with that? And then on the other end, what would you pair with the marathon to the power lifter? Like, how would somebody structure that in the right way, essentially?
Awesome question. I really like that. So if you're the mathematician going to hieroglyphics, you should pair the hieroglyphic learning stuff with things that attenuate white noise. Close all the other tabs in your head. So probably some outdoor time, some meditation, some passive reading, probably some fiction if you were going to read, something just like having nothing to do with it, very story-like, and you don't need to remember. You can just close the book and move on and remember next time you open it up. Do things that allow you to have a quiet and clear mind and focus on, if it's a new thing altogether, getting enough deep sleep. REM sleep is far more tightly auto-regulated, but even better, the need for REM sleep is hugely varied based on the quality of restoration you go through during the day. Meaning, and think about it this way, what causes atypical spikes in norepinephrine? It's either like extreme training you've never done before, novelty, or drugs. And if you live a life that is very streamlined, those three probably don't come into play very often. If you're someone who has a balance over your nutrition and energy levels, you probably don't need a daily dose of caffeine. And if you do, it's once in a while when you do need it. So then, boom, you don't have to worry about a sensitivity issue. And let's say maybe you're pretty lean along the way and healthy, and you're the right age, and you do some little things to help yourself at night. Maybe you take some KSM, maybe you already meditate. Your need for REM sleep has actually gone down because you're, one, never degrading more norepinephrine at the noradrenergic receptor than you can handle.
Andy has mentioned norepinephrine a couple times. It's also called noradrenaline. And a gross oversimplification here, you can sort of think about it like adrenaline in a fight or flight response.
And two, it's being mediated through other means. I think most people in like the niche who are listening to this are aware of the concept of parasympathetic beta oxidation, meaning I can lose fat, quote unquote, for free if I set everything up perfectly.
The parasympathetic nervous system refers to that more chill, rest, and digest state, whereas the sympathetic nervous system is responding to the environment and is more so that fight or flight state. Now, beta oxidation is the breakdown of fatty acids into your bloodstream to be used for energy. So parasympathetic beta oxidation means the breakdown of fatty acids at rest to be used in your bloodstream for energy.
And that's kind of that same analogy here. So if you happen to have great synergy throughout your day, your need for REM sleep does go down. And that opens the door for more deep sleep. And deep sleep is going to be the bare bones foundation for making neurological change. There are times where you need high doses of REM sleep to make neurological change, but they're often very acute.
Okay, so if in that case somebody wants to maximize deep sleep, how would then somebody flip that on its head and then maximize REM if they were to need that?
So if you wanted to maximize REM sleep, it's kind of difficult because REM sleep ironically needs norepinephrine and acetylcholine to ensue. This is why REM sleep's typically paired with melatonin and growth hormones and GABAs in the brain, because they're sedative in their effects. Now, I'm someone who struggles with REM sleep because of that very process of norepinephrine just excites my brain, even in low doses, even though I don't take stimulants, even though I meditate and do all this stuff pre-bed. That's just the person I am. I get excited very easily. So for me to get more REM sleep, ironically enough, peace and acceptance before bed are best. And I've tried everything else. I'm a science guy. I swear to God, I'm not a hippie by trade. I've become a hippie by learning as much as I have. But I've promised, I've tried microdosing, undulating periodization of melatonin. I've done everything you could think of. Nothing works as good as going to bed good with life.
I am so glad that you mentioned that because I put this psychology of sleep episode together where it was basically just what makes sense to me from a sleep standpoint. Like resting your head on the pillow at night, feeling good about your day is so fucking underrated for getting a great sleep. Whereas the person in the contrary position has been go, go, go all day, rest their head on the pillow. And then all of a sudden, all the issues, the unresolved issues from their day pop up and they can't fucking sleep. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that because it's like this sort of taking a deep breath and being like, I earned this. I feel good about my day. And now I can rest easy knowing that and then tackle my day tomorrow. Does that make sense?
Totally. And like I said, if there was a supplement that you could just take to make peace not matter, I'd tell you about it. But and I've tried them. I've tried to come up with them and nothing. So just think about it this way. Let's say you're in that state. We have this amygdala favored balance versus the frontal cortex. You're in bed. Now maybe it's gotten potent enough that you have an ACTH response, which spikes some cortisol.
ACTH is an acronym for adrenocorticotropic hormone, and it is released in response to a stressor.
Now maybe you have more substrate glucose in your bloodstream, which you're not used to at night, which makes you feel a little more energized. Now, having this excess substrate in your bloodstream being metabolized by anybody is going to increase body temperature a little bit. Now we have a state where we have increased neurochemistry, increased body temperature, increased glucose in the blood. So now all of a sudden, that's not a very sleep-like state. And everyone knows this inherently. Melatonin is quickly catalyzed in a bolus-based hormone, kind of like a shotgun. So it's like if you miss that first shotgun shell and you're not asleep, you're not going to sleep, or it's going to be very difficult. And if you take melatonin and stay up, it happens every time. Same thing with that second wind in sleep. If you wake up wide awake at 1 a.m. or 2 a.m., it's going to be a tough night. So when it comes to that stuff, it's really important to ensure that one, you have an environment to sleep that allows peace, because that peace doesn't necessarily need to come from within. I have those eyes that look for light. So I'm like that crazy guy. Like my place is dark, bro. And I'm sure yours probably is too.
Oh yeah.
But it's dark, man. Like if my place isn't clean, I will trip and fall. So that temperature, and as stupid as it sounds, pillows that are appropriately sized for comfort and allow you to sleep the way you want to sleep are probably the most potent ways to facilitate it. And the way I actually tell people to look at it as your body wants to have good sleep. It's going to try to do this on its own. You need to stop getting in the way. So something I see that's really common in our industry is people over supplementing for sleep. They'll take like a gram or two of GABA and melatonin because they're subheads, take all this stuff, and then they pass out great, but wake up wide awake in the middle of the night and can't sleep. And then it becomes a cycle that never ever ends. And that's probably worse or just as bad as trying to go to sleep with anxiety.
Yeah. And it's sort of aiming to over supplement or buffer bad habits. It's like you need to work with the system versus against it. Now, as far as melatonin and that like first wave of sleep, the way that I think and explain it is almost like hunger. So hunger comes up and then sort of dips. You might feel hungry for 10, 20 minutes, and then it sort of dips down again. And gradually, it's like a staircase mechanism, but you don't just feel hungry for hours and hours on end. Like it sort of comes and goes, comes and goes. Is that how people can think about melatonin in the sense that, or getting to sleep in the sense that, if you feel tired, capitalize on that and hit the hay versus staying up, watching another show on Netflix, and then all of a sudden you're wired again. And that turns into like 2 to 3 hours of, more awake time.
Mm-hmm. And then what's very important to delineate from as well is the reason you fall asleep later is a different reason you fall asleep because of that initial circadian melatonin burst. And that even goes into different sleeps as well. And it's interesting, especially with the over supplementation, staying up late at night, or maybe watching an exciting show before bed rather than something relaxing. GABA has a U-shaped curve in its function and manifestations in people. Meaning, at first, GABA is very, very sedative. Then, as you climb doses in the blood-brain barrier, it gets very, very stimulatory. And then, of course, it comes back down. It's this U-shaped curve. And that is because GABA is a modulator of the glutamate receptor. And that is a much different definition than people thinking GABA is a hormone that binds to a GABA receptor. And that delineation is majorly important because it's similar to like what SARMs have aimed to do.
SARMs is an acronym for Selective Androgen Receptor Modulator. And SARMs were created in order to be more selective than things like anabolic steroids. So you can sort of target certain things and not other things, versus anabolic steroids are more systemic, meaning they impact the body as a whole.
You're aiming to change the shape of what's normal, and then being the normal shape different, what binds to it is going to act then differently as well. So it's not just a triangle to a perfect triangle anymore. It's a triangle to maybe a slightly different version of the triangle. GABA does that, obviously endogenously.
Endogenously just means inside the body, and exogenously would be referred to as outside of the body.
When that happens, the doses are determining the degree to which and the receptivity of the receptor. So as it goes up and GABA gets lightly saturated over these glutamate receptors, we actually have an increase in glutamate typically. And then until it's so hypersaturated that you're, paraplegic essentially, is only when it comes back down to relaxing again. So the reason I bring it up is when it comes to supplementing for sleep, it's the same thing as like, how much food do I need to eat to lose weight? It's like, well, as much as you can handle. But that's the answer, right? So if you're someone who needs a lot of help to go to sleep, then you might need some minerals and some stuff to be properly balanced. But if you're tired and it's already set to put you to bed properly, you don't need anything else.
That makes sense. Now, do you believe that night owls exist?
To a degree, right? I think it's a personality thing, but there's definitely an incredibly small population that is like truly having some type of circadian dysregulation and does not need help.
I basically talk about sleep in a way that just negates the night owl altogether, because if we take, electricity and the light bulb out of the equation, it's just like you said, it's going to be such a small percentage of the population. How can somebody figure out if they're truly a night owl? Chances are, if you're listening to this podcast, you are not. But, how can somebody figure that? Yeah. How can somebody figure that out?
You have major problems elsewhere, actually. Because I'm thinking, I only know two. And they are true insomniacs from like childhood.
Broderick is one of them.
Broderick is one of them. The other one's my good friend, Tyler.
Broderick is actually how I became aware of Andy's work because they are colleagues, and so that's who we are talking about. Broderick is a coach as well.
Um, but yeah, they not that they have major issues elsewhere, but they one truly don't need it, and two, they have weird things where it's like they can both handle massive amounts of stimulants and be fine. They both have an incredibly powerful nervous system. Like there are very interesting differences I see between Broderick and my friend Tyler, which is funny because they couldn't be more polar opposite. Uh, Broderick is obviously shorter, stockier, and old and Caucasian. My friend Tyler is young, 6'4", 6'3", black, and 270 pounds,
Whoa.
and natural.
Oh my God.
Yeah, he's like an 800-pound deadlifter. He's like, yeah, incredible dude. But they have such eerily similar parts of their, because I'm actually very close with both of them. Brain chemistry, personality, even to the point of like how they act in certain scenarios and lift. So it just begets what operating system is this person using? And I don't have the answer to that, but clearly they have some type of suprachiasmatic nucleus spinal cord difference.
The suprachiasmatic nucleus is essentially the master clock in the body. So it is responsible for fundamentally letting your body know what time of day it is, and it does so primarily via light exposure entering the eye.
Interesting. If you were to just hypothesize, what do you think that is? I find that fun to just be like, I wonder what that, like, what do you think?
I think it's a choline trigger because I've thought about this before. So we need acetylcholine to be active to get into our muscarinic part of the nervous system, which is what makes your vagus nerve activate in the first place. What's weird about that is that one, it's very low on the priority scale for choline actually, because choline is typically an excitatory ligand. It's for contractions. So that means you need to have enough left over in the first place to properly get into that muscarinic system. So what I kind of theorize is they have some type of one massive overproduction of choline, which is why they can't sleep. And oftentimes when people with insomnia do sleep, it's not a real sleep. It's like I forget the terminology, non-REM dependent sleep, something like that. NRDS, I think, whatever it is. But there's this very specific type of subcategory sleep that they have, or they have wildly potent REM sleep, which makes sense from a noradrenergic perspective, but also makes sense from an acetylcholine perspective, that the only time they get into REM sleep, it's like watching the trippiest movie on the planet, because they need to have or must have this higher amount of acetylcholine active. So maybe they have quanta sacs of acetylcholine that are bigger, more sensitive. Maybe it recycles faster. Maybe it degrades faster. But I think that's what it would be, because that's like the true linkage between your light dark cycles.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing to think about in the context of Broderick and your friend Tyler too, because Broderick is obviously not natural, and you said that your buddy Tyler is, and how sleep ties in with recovery and how important that is, where it's like, that's fascinating that they can both be fine and recover in drastically different circumstances and scenarios.
Yeah, be such different organisms, because you would expect like, okay, then everyone with insomnia is going to be like maybe like average height, below average weight, below average muscle mass, and like maybe normal intellect. You know what I mean? What's funny is they're actually both very smart. Tyler is very, very smart as well. They also both hate the insomnia, which is a small part. And that's probably society's fault. It's probably not their fault. I bet if they could do whatever they wanted and the sun was up all day, they would never have a problem. But yeah, it's an interesting thing. But like, it's funny. Everyone's the 1%er of something, right? So I've met someone who doesn't produce the enzyme for adrafinil and modafinil. He could take a whole bottle and just nothing will happen. The enzyme doesn't get produced in his body.
Oh, that's wild.
Modafinil and adrafinil are both very powerful stimulants, much more so than something like caffeine.
Yeah, but that's only supposed to be, I think in the research, it said 1 to 3% of the world's population. So in a sense, everyone is like a 1%er for something. And then the rest of you is probably pretty average.
Something that's interesting about Broderick is that he doesn't require a lot of sleep. I've consumed enough of his content that I can tell when he hasn't gotten his requirement though. Like his word recall isn't quite as sharp, and then his mood and things like that. He's a hilarious personality to begin with, so it's like quite pronounced, I find. But when he's like on it, like I'd be super curious to see what the difference is in his sleep structure, quality, length, and all that sort of stuff. It'd be interesting to know.
So that specifically is the noradrenergic inhibition stuff. So word recall, if we think about what memory is a neuron that has stored information being activated. And then we'll call that neuron A. So it's somewhere up here. It's activated, the information's available. Because don't forget, it's not just electricity flowing through the spinal cord. If you think about it that way, it actually makes it seem pretty stupid. It's like, oh, this thing is just a fucking power plant, like just outlets, you know? Every piece of information, or I gave it away, every piece of electricity has information attached to it. So it's far more sophisticated. So we have the information coming from neuron A, this memory, coming down and transcending into neuron B through a synapse. The gate at the synapse is the noradrenergic receptor, because more oftentimes than not, it's, again, acetylcholine going to be what's activating and communicating here. So if your receptor for acetylcholine is maybe not as sensitive due to X, but what that really means is when it binds, instead of getting 10 points, you got anywhere from 1 to 9. You know, it's not as sensitive. So the same thing is giving you less yield. And that is what's specifically recovered during REM sleep. And that is what the dream aspect from a cholinergic standpoint is actually doing. So you even get the length of your dreams, and sorry not to interrupt, but you could even theorize that the length and intensity of your dreams has to do with the amount of noradrenergic inhibition you need to be relieved from.
So is it safe to say then that these guys, you know, we're using Broderick and Tyler as examples here, that these guys are getting an equal amount of recovery or restorative nature of, say, we're throwing out numbers, in 4 hours that some other person would get in 8?
So it's either that or their receptors incredibly resistant to being desensitized.
Okay. Can you explain that?
It would be like, you know, you have your Metro card to get on the subway or your credit card, whatever. And it's like, damn, I never have to refill this thing. Like, I just keep going. Like, I haven't paid it once, but I just keep going. And people just are fine with it. So that would be like, I use that analogy of 10. So it's like, for them to get down to a 9 or an 8, you just have to do like 50 times the amount of norepinephrine binding that maybe you or me would need.
Okay. So switching gears a little bit to dopamine, how should folks think about dopamine? It's a really misunderstood, you know, concept as a whole. Is it a learning chemical? Is it the molecule of more? You know, what is dopamine? How should people think about it?
So this was one of the first parts of Go Superbrain as well. And it's on the encyclopedia. And it's the umbrella hormone, meaning it's the very, very top and everything else gets catalyzed into it. So right off the bat, you can't talk about it in like a very adjective-based scenario because it's the parent. That's like saying like, I don't know, like the US, the United States. So the United States, what? Like the government, like the people, like geography, like what, man? Like, well, you can't just say that and like start putting adjectives to it. You know, you have to say what. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that it's neighborhood specific. So dopamine acting on your frontal cortex is different than dopamine being metabolized maybe in the motor cortex or the auditory or the amygdala, you know, and all these different things. And then probably just to get from a quick thing before you start asking questions, the last thing to remember with dopamine is its motivation and opportunity. It is not action. So it's always going to be the feeling of, not the of.
So it's more anticipatory versus outcome based, essentially.
Totally.
Okay. So how can folks think about that in relation to things like, treat foods, junk foods? Like, it's almost like a drug addict that is it's the whole process of getting the drug, not even necessarily the high itself. It's the whole lead up, and then there's like this sense of relief. But how can folks think about that?
I like it. So I have a good story for it. So if it's the type of cheat meal, treat, snack, whatever that makes you not taste the food in the first half,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
then that was completely neurochemical and you lost the discipline game. The only time I would say the sensation of a refeed or a cheat or a treat was needed is if you bite into it, then you get a greater rush than you had beforehand, and your body will thank you. Like it will be like, wow, I feel good now. I needed that. And then if you just think about, because everyone's felt both of those, right? Where it's like, oh, the Ben and Jerry's is gone, and I just realized it was chocolate. Like
I blacked out. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Or it's like you get all this fast food, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, I only have French fries left, and they're pretty good now. But like all you eat everything else. That's most of them. So most of the time is you're probably just low on neurochemistry. You haven't done anything novel or exciting all day long, or maybe in a while, or maybe you rely on this dopaminergic drive to attenuate and resist your cortisol responses that you have through the day to get you through the day. Because maybe you've never imposed another strategy to relieve yourself from that besides dopamine, because dopamine is going to inhibit, through progesterone like mechanisms, these cortisol responses. So it's like, whoa, all right. So I've just taught myself that's good. Going back to there is a risk to learning. It's not just you'll get fat if you have a bunch of cheat meals. It's you're going to lose a lot more than that along the way. So I think you said it best. It's like that staircase of hunger. But for other people where maybe it's too hard or they haven't flexed and grown their discipline muscle enough yet, distract yourself. Get like I love my kendama. It's like the ball and stick game where you have to get the ball into the stick, get a fidget, walk your dog, do 5 push-ups, clip your toenails. I don't know. Like pick a task to do that will distract you from looking for sensation, and then give yourself a fair rule. I'm going to take out the trash, do this, this, and this, and if my feelings still haven't changed, then I'll drink a ton of water, see what happens, and then decide if I need it.
Yeah, those are awesome strategies, and using distraction to your advantage in that sense. And this also kind of comes into learning itself, because I think that there are multiple ways to sort of quote unquote fill yourself that aren't food focused. Like I've noticed that when I feel really accomplished for the day and I might learn something new in, the fitness realm, or when it comes to language or something like that, I feel satisfied in a way that sort of translates over into that food situation or food environment situation. So like, how can folks think about that? I'm not sure if I explained that in a concise way, but yeah,
I love how intuitive you are with all this stuff. And like,
oh, thanks, man.
You're really good at what you do. I wanted to let you know that, but
Oh, thank you.
You're right. And you just described and like kind of defended what I said, whether you know it or not. It's neurochemistry you're looking for. It's not food necessarily. So you got it from reflection and gaining pride and knowing that you did things within your morals and you defended those and it was a good day, and that relieves and gives you that neurochemistry. For me, it's actually catching up with some of my friends on the phone. So one of the big things I promised myself when I got off social media, I realized I was like, I have all these followers, I supposedly have all these friends, but one, I don't know shit about any of them, and two, the only conversations we ever have are either comments, responding to a story, or like whatever, like maybe an email or two, and then unless you need me, right? So I was like, I want to have fulfilling friendships and relationships in my life. So when I kind of get to near the end of my day, when it's not quite like sleepy time yet. I replaced TV time and that ambiguous, like, what am I going to do? Am I going to go to the supermarket, or, that like spinning around time, with talking to my friends? It gives me tons of peace. So for me, it's like that social, serotonin, oxytocin rush is what attenuates a lot of those feelings of stress for me, and then allows me to be properly relaxed at night. So not to take it back fully to a metaphysical place, but that need for neurochemistry can be as simple as like lacking positivity, lacking mindfulness and stuff. Because think about how many things you go through the day where you can choose to get a neurochemical response from them.
Right.
Like, I talked about my morning thing. I could wake up and be like, oh, I'm this fat bastard. Now I got to lose weight and sit on the treadmill. I'm just going to listen to death metal and like, you can do things a lot of different ways. So you can choose to like reap all the neurochemistry you want doing something through mindfulness, or you can just choose to ignore it and then deal with the perils later on that night.
Yeah. And I think we can be our own best friends or our own worst enemies in that sense, right? Like we can work with the machine or, swim upstream and work against it. Like circling back to getting light exposure in the morning, like that just makes sense to set your body up for success over the course of the day,
Mm-hmm. And it's, so many people talk about waking up with anxiety and then not being able to eat and then having all these like weird problems that don't seem correlative, but are correlative in the morning. And how many of them get fixed by waking up 30 minutes earlier? I don't know when it became popular to like try to wake up and do everything to get ready for work within 30 minutes or 40 minutes, but that sounds like anxiety ridden to me, just saying. Dude, we got on the phone or the Zoom at 7:30. I've been up since 5:45, and this was the first thing I had to do all day. I just need that time to cultivate and do this stuff. I always joke with my colleagues and stuff, because I'm just known as being like the high energy guy and like always passionate and stuff. And sometimes I won't answer my phone at like 9:30 at night. They're like, dude, what are you doing? I'm like, sleeping. You think this is free? I don't just
exactly.
This isn't free, So being more mindful and gaining neurochemistry when you can from mundane things is a skill that everyone needs to harness. And I think people ironically harness it whether they know it or not. So if you're one of those chip on your shoulders type people where I can only lose weight after like my significant other breaks up with me, or after I lose my job, or I can only lose weight once I've hit rock bottom. I can never lose weight for me just to be healthier. If you're one of those people, you are actually the unhealthy version of what I just described. You have to find mindfulness and find this deep sense of self to get the neurochemistry response from the tasks that you're doing. You could just only do it through traumatic means.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, totally. I really wrapped my head around it with all the elite level athletes and executives I've come to in the last year or two, because people that are truly like, no one can do what this person can do, like, which is why I've been so confidential and all that stuff. But you also get exposed to how does somebody get this good at something? And it's oftentimes, I've noticed, unless they have some type of other reason or are perfectly balanced or whatever, a lot of people are hyper successful because of a trauma that puts a chip on their shoulder. And that chip on their shoulder lets them be present, even though it's through maybe a slightly negative means sometimes, lets them be present in the tasks they care about. So again, even though it might be outwardly negative, sometimes it's, I'm here, this matters, I'm gonna do this. And even if it's because like, screw this person who made me feel this way, the right things are still happening. Even though it's through negative emotions and connotation, the right things are happening from a brain neurochemical standpoint. So it's not a surprise that the outcome is then manifested.
That totally makes sense. So basically, the first person that I think of is Michael Jordan. It's basically a dude that hates losing more than he likes to win.
Yes.
Okay. I think that'll be helpful for folks. They've probably all seen The Last Dance,
Yeah, and it's just like, it makes sense. So it's like, when you talk to people who have lost a large amount of weight in their life, that response gets triggered by gaining even a little bit of weight, even if it's 24 hours, or because if you took a red eye flight and like your body's all messed up. But when our fear response gets triggered, that's a far greater neurochemical rush than maybe dealing with a small failure or a small success. And we need to, if you want to be the best version of yourself, you need to be able to not retrain that, but give another option available. And we call this rising to the occasion. We talk about this as like the best traits people have in their lives. That person's so positive no matter what happens. Whether they are or aren't positive, all this is a separate but potent neurochemical pathway that they've associated to their brain, that when something very scary, difficult, whatever happens, instead of responding with aversion and fear, they respond with X.
Okay. So how do you think about positive and negative then? I tend to approach it more from a like taking a certain perspective versus another perspective. But how, like when you say positive, negative, how should folks think about that?
So it's actually your own perception of it. So for example, I'm someone like, who's a pretty, I would call typically positive, happy, upbeat, whatever. I have some friends in Boston who just like in the center of Boston, they're just like rough dudes, like great humans, like some of my best friends. And there's a bunch of them. They're just like rough dudes, like, "What's up, buddy? Fuck you, you're so stupid. Ha 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 ha. Yeah, I'm gonna kick you out." Like it's like those types of people. And you wouldn't think it's positive, like the jokes, the mannerisms, the verbiage. But to them it is positive. And they're like, you look at them and you're like, wow, this person's actually getting a positive response. Like, that's genuinely happy. He just told me to go F myself, but he was happy, So it's what it means to you. So some people are happy staying home all day, doing nothing, and eating like tuna out of a can. Some people need to go out 5 nights a week and everywhere in between. And what's chaos to one is peace to the other. So, and it's funny, that's why I keep saying I'm not a hippie by trade. I've learned enough that I've become a hippie. So if you're just truly at peace and cool and really believe guilt-free what you're doing is good for you, you probably will get some of those results.
That belief thing reminded me of a question that I wanted to ask you about transgendered studies and how the brain changes. So please delve into that because this shit is fascinating.
Super cool. So the prerequisite knowledge you have to understand is DNFs, derived nootropic factors, and the letter that comes before it just tells you like who made it. So if it's a G, your glia made it. If it's a B, a cortical area made it. I think there's like an NM, like it's a neuromuscular factor. It tells you who made it, but DNF means it's a learning peptide. It's going to be like, instead of waiting for the fire to build up to get your sword hot, you're like, here's some kerosene. It just gets way bigger fire faster. These are what we call endocrine hormones, and not endocrine from your endocrine system, endocrine from a vehicle, meaning that they are produced endogenously within the brain. And then they can either be para, auto, or exo, meaning they're going to leave their area, go somewhere else. So you can have a brain learning peptide leave the brain, interact with the spinal cord. You can have it go from one cell and one cortical area to another, which would be para, meaning it's like we're neighbors. It's like, here, take this. Or it could be auto, meaning it's within the same system and then stays within the same system. So released from the amygdala, stays in the amygdala, released from the frontal cortex, goes to the auditory cortex, or released from the motor cortex, goes to the spine. That's kind of vaguely how these go about. And these are going to be stimulated by a little bit of vigilance and a little bit of biology. Same thing with cortisol. We all know at this point, cortisol is not purely biological. It's very much encompassed by your visual field and emotions as well. These are similar to a degree. However, it's more about the sensation of novelty and actually having proper glucose metabolism of the brain. And that's because I told you this stuff is not free. It's
Mhm.
very costly. So the same way someone with a lot of glycolytic enzymes can't get jacked is the same concept here. If you don't have an ability to fuel your brain with a lot of glucose quickly, or be able to switch into beta oxidation very well, you just can't learn because you can't pay that cost. Like you can't go to that restaurant if you don't make that much money. So assuming you've done those things, the transgender studies were showing that the power of sheer unadulterated raw belief over years is enough to make conformational changes to your brain. And that's something that people were kind of okay with at first. People in the sense of like, well, if I believe for 30 years I'm a bad person, I'll probably get my amygdala bigger. If I believe for 30 years I'm a philosopher, even though I'm actually, paper filler, my frontal cortex will still probably, hypertrophy a little bit. You know what I mean? But the transgender studies were earth shattering because it's like, wow, these are sex traits that are showing this. And the reason I love them so much, these studies, is because it goes to show that even things that you think in our brain are like the old dog can't learn new tricks, it does not apply even a little bit. And what's even crazier, they did some further transgender studies where you can actually go back technically in the sense of you can alter your belief enough that you make a second change. It's not even just once you can change. You can change more than once in life if the belief is there. And that's what the coolest thing is. And that's why I'm such a big promoter of introspection, meditation, faith, and being positive, because it's not that it's like a better quality of life at all. Like, I mean, sure it is, right? But the reason I'm saying it is because those are the tools for change. So you could be like my Boston friends and like rough around the edges, but believe it and still get that positive response. Or you can be super miserable and fake it hard enough that it works. You just have to actually do it.
Okay, so in the instance of, you said that there are sex changes essentially. So what is going on there? Or do you mean physically? Do you mean in relation to gender? Like, how should folks think about that?
That's more so it's not like you could like think yourself to growing hair.
Yeah.
It's not.
I just wanted to be clear about that. Yeah.
Yeah. You can't think yourself into that stuff. But what happens is like there are slight alterations in the values of sex hormones you're secreting, and like circadian rhythm changes related to being a male or a female, and certain gut bacteria changes.
Oh, interesting. Gut bacteria. It makes me think of sort of, there's this sliding scale. There's like PCOS in women and things like that. And there are advantages to that, especially in the fitness realm and sports and things like that. But, even physical characteristics of men, we have women, but then we have women that are more on the feminine side, the more on the masculine side. And the same thing with men, and how, potentially their personalities, their beliefs can shape the way that they look, their endocrine systems and all that sort of stuff. It is absolutely fascinating.
Well, and what's even more fascinating is one, you can describe different organs, organ systems, and sections of our body as being predominantly male or female via characteristics. And that has nothing to do with what you are as a base male or female. So, for example, we have ideas of how the auditory cortex in a male should function, and it's actually slightly different in a female. Not like as different as your liver or like your uterus to like, hip area, but it is slightly different. That has to do with like your amygdala hypothalamus relationship. So it's like you can be a male who has slightly more feminine characteristics of their auditory cortex and amygdala and their hypothalamus. And you could be a female who has that exact superimposed concept. Livers, obviously frontal cortexes, your anterior cingulate, which has to do with, what makes you feel something in somebody else. And all this stuff can be like composed of, is a slightly more male or female, male or female, male or female. And I guess to even step away from the concept of it's not necessarily male or female, I like the term operating system, because, not that someone can get offended over anything, but it's not male or female in the sense of like, I don't have a boy liver. It's not blue, and my liver's not pink. It's a girl liver. It's just what things tend to happen with the hormones and metabolisms in that like person. So if you want to be a freaky athlete, no matter what, unless it's like marathon running or like different types of sports, the major niche of the fitness world is resistance training. If you're resistance training in general, it's probably more beneficial to have like a male based amygdala with a female based liver than the opposite.
Yeah, I like that distinction between it's not male, female, it is the operating system. It takes the
Mac
sort
or
of
PC.
association out of it. Yeah. So what would be an example of a male or female liver, the auditory system? Like, how can folks think about that practically speaking?
So it's like we have this activation of the barest bones parts of our brain, which you could say are like frontal. It's a line of the limbic system and like the guys that they attach to. So like from your frontal cortex to your cerebellum and everything you cross through in like this S-like shaped manner from the front to the back of the brain is going to be like your true operating systems, meaning like these are the things that will directly impact everything else, from like your hypothalamus, which is going to control mostly your metabolic based stuff, everywhere from like vasopressin to parts of blood pressure to insulins and like appetite hormones and all that stuff. Then you have your amygdala and your frontal cortex, which are going to be like decision making and instant changes. Then we have our anterior cingulate in between the two, which is going to be empathy, and all these things. And this is like your base self, right? I guess we could call it. And as those, like imagine it like Simon says, one turns on, the other doesn't. This turns on, this one doesn't. Like that. That's going to begin the adaptation periods in life, right? As a child. Then you interact with the world and those adaptations change again because now we have your base self who's taken in data and interacted with the world. It's called allostasis, right? It's how we change in real life, even though it's not huge changes. Then you get to maybe you're in your mid-20s, you have a firm idea of who you are, who you want to be, and your goals don't change much for a couple of years. And you go adapting, and then you end up with what your body thought was the best possible way to change relative to these stressors. And that's how these systems change. And the funny part is the actual mechanism is very simple. It's the same way we store memory is the same way you will ultimately maybe have a female or male auditory complex. So the male auditory complex is going to be much more refined to ranges of sounds and changes, and it's going to be much more sympathetically active through the amygdala, meaning if your amygdala is off as a male, your hearing is usually not as good, whereas females are more refined to certain decibel ranges. Obviously childbearing and stuff is going to make it impact acutely on the female auditory cortex as well. So the way it changes is funny because it's really simple. It's just LTP causes shape changes like the sword, and we get hormones, and that's it. That's the way everything changes in the brain, this neuroplastic stuff. But the change is complex, even though the way it changes is simple.
Oh man, the evolutionary biology piece to all that sort of stuff is absolutely fascinating. Now, where can folks find you, Go Superbrain, the stuff that you're working on? You don't have social right now, from my understanding, so they can't follow you.
I did open an Instagram about 2 weeks ago, just 2 weeks ago for Go Superbrain, because I think that was like a logical move. I also have a team, so I have a web design team and SEO team. I'm really speaking to a social media manager today to get all that stuff going full speed. But GoSuperbrain.com or via Instagram is the best place to find me because they will be hubs to other places to find me. But realistically, email at andy@theperformancevibe.com or theperformancevibe.com are the only other places to find me.
Awesome, man. I'll link to all that stuff.
That episode was absolutely packed with amazing information. If you struggled to comprehend some of that stuff, like I mentioned in the intro, you can go back and listen to this, 2-3 times, and you will get more and more each time around. Also, if you're interested in applying for one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can click the link in the description below or head on over to n1fitness.com/coaching. Follow me up on Instagram at N1Fitness, on TikTok at the N1Fitness, and feel free to friend me on Facebook at Marcus Sadu. Thank you so much to the folks that have taken 30 seconds out of their day to leave a review on their favorite podcast platform. I truly appreciate it, and that's how we reach more folks with this information. And lastly, be sure to hit the subscribe button. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will catch you on the next episode. See ya.